Welcome to Planet of the Associations. I'm Seth Kahn.
And I'm Mark Levy.
And this is the vlog, the video blog of Planet of the Associations.
And what Planet of the Associations is it's a vlog and podcast which talks about the association of the near future, not the association 100 years from now, not the association of 50 years from now. X plus 3. It's wherever you are in time, it's 3 years from now. If you are listening to this 100 years from now, it's 103 years from when we're broadcasting this right now. So hello, future. That's what I'll say right now. And let me tell you a story about opening this. Seth and I never know where, I think this is apparent to listeners, we never know where this is going to go. But we begin, there's a triggering idea, and then we just run with it there. So I want to tell you about a very quick story, and we'll look at how the story might relate to associations. So I was watching, and this is a couple of years ago, I was watching the sitcom Parks and Rec. Right? Everyone knows Parks and Rec. It's a brilliant sitcom. So in one of the episodes, Tom wanted to open his own restaurant, his own eatery. And so a realtor set up to have him visit in Indianapolis, that's where the show takes place, like a bunch of different eateries that had closed because they were already outfitted with kitchens and what like that. And the very first eatery they took him to, the owner was there. And so the owner opened the door and he walked in the eatery, and you saw this big logo up in the eatery, and it said Jurassic Fork. And within the eatery, there was this plastic jungle. You know, there was this thick jungle foliage, and there was animatronic T-Rex and other dinosaurs there and whatnot. And so Tom said to the founder, to the owner, he said, "Hey man, what happened? I thought Jurassic Fork was so popular. Like, why did you guys close?" And the owner said, "We stretched ourselves too thin by expanding to a second location." And so Tom said, "Wait a minute, you opened another dinosaur themed restaurant?" And the owner said, "No, we opened another Steven Spielberg themed restaurant, the German place downtown, Schindler's Lunch." And then Tom says, "I think you may have misunderstood what people liked about Jurassic Fork." And so to me, the idea, right? It's like, I thought, by the way, whenever I laugh at something, I teach clients this, about creating content yourself, that I say, you walk around and you have extreme reactions to things all day long. Stuff gets you angry. Stuff gets you frustrated. Your stuff is joyful. You can't believe how great something is. You can't believe how horrible something is. And I say, what those extreme reactions are doing is that they're actually giving you data that's important, that may have lessons contained in them, or stories contained in them, or exercises contained in them, right? So you're workshopping great material for your differentiation, for products, for services, for speeches or whatnot. So you should walk around being very conscious of when you feel an extreme, either in the moment or maybe when you play back the day a little while later. Think to yourself, what was happening there? What was my extreme reaction? Why was it so extreme? And like, how can I use that? Like, the key is, how can I use that? Right. So, so with this, I so loved this episode or this scene. And at the time, and I'm looking at notes I wrote about it, I said, at times we misunderstand what makes something work. Right? Tom says, "I think you may have misunderstood what people liked about Jurassic Fork." We misunderstand what makes things work. We misascribe the reasons why something's successful, or there may be a variety of reasons, and we oversimplify and distort, and we pin success to one reason instead of many reasons or whatnot. So there's my opening trigger, Seth. Take that and run with it, my friend.
All right, with Jurassic Fork, I'll run with that.
Right.
So, I'm going to go into the emotional content of what you said, because a lot of times what you see when people talk about emotions is that they feel it's a distraction from their work because they're on this roller coaster ride that's sucking their energy, right? And they're like, why am I so upset about this? Why can't I just keep an even keel and keep on marching? Why can't I do what I set out to do? What about my to-do list today? What's going to go by the wayside because I'm all angry about this event that happened with some stupid customer service person, right? We've all got those.
So, I had that today.
Yeah. Well, you might. I don't know if you're going to want to get into that. Right, we may go down that road, but we'll see. But at any point, Ray Kurzweil, who is this amazing, forecaster of technology. In fact, he's like the chief technology officer at Google because he has been so on the mark. He predicted the internet like 40 years before it happened. He's been successfully predicting one technology after another. He talks about emotions as actually being the frontier of knowledge. That when we look at how technology is going to be able to take information and process analytics, what technology will never be able to do is to not just appreciate a beautiful piece of music, but create a beautiful piece of music. And he says that when all of the machines have taken over all of the work that human beings can do, when our IBM Watsons, right, have totally like taken over the world with all of their processing power, the one frontier that we'll be pushing into, that we've already started to push into, is our emotional response to the world around us. I just think that's fascinating, this idea that our emotions could be the frontier of human knowledge.
That's an interesting way you just put it at the end, that our emotions can be the frontier to human knowledge, right? Because emotions seem, they've always been ascribed to being ephemeral. They come and go, and the idea that something so ephemeral could lead the way in something brand new is interesting. But what I'm not understanding is, so computers can't feel real emotion, but could they feel simulated emotion that would lead to a real place or a better place?
We don't know that. I mean, we don't know what actually goes on in the computer. We don't know what it takes. In fact, when we look at how consciousness is created with all of the different activities that go on in the body and the brain, we don't know if you hit a certain point where there's a critical mass of activity and then suddenly you have this sense of I am or this beingness, or if it's imbued from some foreign force. I mean, we really don't know. Even if you look at the frontiers of interpersonal neurobiology, which is Dan Siegel is the person who's really pushing that forward, right? He talks about how our entire instrument, and I love this because of my theater background, our entire instrument is the knowledge creation machine that we are equipped with. So it's not just our brain, it's not just our neurons. And he starts extending it first into all 5 of our senses, but then he goes out beyond the body itself and to look at the space between in relationship, as he imagines, that we are each a node in a network, and that network includes not just other human beings, but it includes all life forms, including the planet itself. When you start thinking about the sense of beingness or entityness as being part of this web, there's a really different kind of value that emerges. And this is, by the way, I think extraordinarily relevant to associations because they bring together a particular profession or trade, which is like a neural net. You've got essentially a neural net, only each of the nodes is a human being. And one of the questions is, how do you create value? How do you harvest value? How do you deliver value inside that net?
Right. Well, we were talking earlier before we were on the air. I was telling you I was having a conversation with my friend Dov Baron, who's the prominent podcaster, the leadership podcaster, and I had told him a story that I had talked about in an earlier episode about Patton Oswalt, and the casinos, and he thought he had given no value because he hadn't told a joke. And the casino owner thought that he gave unbelievable value because all the high rollers were laughing their heads off and giving a standing ovation, even though he hadn't told a joke. And it was the idea of what is value. And when I told that story to Dov, he loved it. And he said, value is values-based. That you know how to create value, or about what you can appreciate as value based on the values in the room, like based on people's values, right? So I found that I'm always kind of looking for recipes or methodologies. It comes from being a magician, like a miracle's happening and a magician's always trying to think, how can I replicate that or better it?
Right.
So I really like that idea, because it was this idea of what are your values or what are their values? And now how do you create something that can be taken away or experienced based on one of those values?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because if you think of value as values-based, it puts it firmly in the category of subjective, right? It's not objective. It's not, value doesn't exist outside of the people who are valuing it. I think it's easy to forget that, because we start thinking of value in terms of revenue, right? Revenue is like, if you put $10 in the bank, it's there whether you know it's there or not. It's subjective. It exists. But does somebody find it compelling to seek it, to desire it, to yearn for it? Are they willing to trade something for it? Maybe, maybe not. So then you get into, what do they value, right? Some people do value money and they're willing to do pretty much anything to make as much of it as they can. But other people have very different values. And when you get into associations, you're really looking at groups of people who have values in common, right? Like they may want to excel at their profession, or they may want their trade, their organization to adapt to the new world that we're in, as we have our relationship with China shifts as we come out of the pandemic, and so on and so forth. Those are values that people bring. And once you tap one of like a value that a lot of members have in common, it's like hitting a vein when you're looking for gold, right? It's like all of a sudden this energy opens up and people want to participate, and there's excitement in the room. And I think one of the things we're always interested in is, how do we find that vein? How do we find that thing that can be tapped like that?
Well, if you were leading a workshop right now for association leaders, on how to find a vein to tap to create an emotional reaction, a reaction that's based on values. And, like combining everything that we've been talking about so far, where emotion is at the frontier of knowledge creation and value is values-based, right, or whatnot. It's all in your lap. Seth Kahn, it's all up to you. What would the exercise be?
Well, I'd use JumpStart Storytelling, which is one of my favorite exercises. It's actually an exercise that I created that's in international currency right now, used in many organizations around the world. And it's about getting the audience to tell stories from their personal life. And let me tell you a little bit about how it works and why I'm using it in response to the question that you're asking. This exercise was created with the Center for Association Leadership, with the Story Institute, and with the World Bank. And we were looking at how to accelerate rapport in a professional conference, because what we discovered was that most conference attendees really start to gel in the sense of having increased rapport and comfort with the other attendees around the middle of the second day, which unfortunately for many conferences, in fact, for the majority of them, is when they're headed to the airport to leave and go back home. And so we wanted to accelerate that process, because once that conference gels, you move into a completely different level of performance. And so we found that storytelling and story listening in a structured way did that. And so we started using this exercise at the beginning of conferences, because we could really accelerate into much more rapport between the attendees. So the thinking is that when you start off a conference, you have one person in front of the room who speaks for 45 minutes. And that is one of the least effective ways to kick off a conference. Everybody starts going to sleep, doing their email. And when it's over, you'll notice that only one person has bonded with the other people in the room, and that's the speaker. And the way you can tell that is because there's a big line up there with the speaker of people who want to talk to him or her, but everybody else is working on their notes, getting a cup of coffee, going to the bathroom. There's very little energy in the room. When you're a facilitator, you look for energy. And the thing about JumpStart Storytelling is that it creates a beehive of energy. Everybody's talking all at once. And the way it works is that you'll start the conference off with, and the speaker will say, I want to tell you a story from my own life around the topic for why we're gathered here. And then I want you to turn to the people at your table, and I want each person to just take 90 seconds and share a story from their life around the topic that we've gathered for. And there's a little bit more structure to that. But if you've got 7 people at a table, it only takes 10 and a half minutes for each person to go for 90 seconds. And so very quickly, you've heard that you're listening to the story of 6 other people at your table, plus the guy in the front of the room. Then you shake up the room. Everybody gets up out of their chair. They go to another table and you do the same thing again. And so now you've heard, 12, 13 stories, and it's all taken place in less than half an hour. And then you have the stories surface. And this is where the facilitation comes in. You ask people to pick the stories that were most resonant to them for whatever reason, subjectively. And then people choose that story. And then you take the top 2 or 3 stories and you tell them to the whole group. And then you start to unpack those stories. And now this is where you get to the values, where there's excitement, where there's energy, because whatever that top set of stories is about is something that group, as a group, feels strongly enough about to have selected them as the most compelling stories. So, for example, I do a lot of leadership training. And so I tell stories of personal leadership. Some of the most remarkable stories that I remember from events, there was one where a guy told a story. He was an older man. He talked about when he was a Boy Scout troop leader decades ago. He was helping to take a group of Boy Scouts on a trip on these rapids. And they had about 8 canoes. And as they were going, there was a whirlpool. And one by one, each of the canoes went into the whirlpool and dumped with these kids in it. So he jumps out of his canoe and he swims into the whirlpool and he drags the kid out, the first kid out, puts him on the bank, and then goes back for another kid. And then a couple of other adults do the same thing. And at the end, all the kids are safe. They're all on the beach. They're all drenched. They're all gasping for air. The adults are freaked out. They're all sitting there kind of recovering together. And he said, that was a leadership experience for him because he saw a dangerous situation. He sized it up. He knew what action he had to take, and he did it without hesitation. But then when we unpack the story, when we ask the audience, why did you select that story today while we're gathered here as a leadership story, it turns out that there's another part of the story that was really important to the room. And that was that all of those members of that scout troop became incredibly close from that crisis. So close that in the decades that followed, they went to each other's weddings. They were the best men at each other's weddings. They went to each other's birthday parties. They stayed in touch with all of their life events, and they're still in touch to this day. And that group then zeroed in, and you could feel the energy when they were talking about it, like that, like there was a warmth and a leaning in. That idea that a single act of leadership in a crisis moment could create a lifelong bond among a group of people became one of the core ideas for the entire conference. And it was referred back to, it even had a name, the whirlpool, right? And people would reference it. So that's an example where you see the value that's in the room, but the way that you get to it is not by telling people what it is. It's by letting by crowdsourcing the activity and then looking for where there's common resonance. And that's a key. It's as much about listening as it is about stimulating that crowd, right? So you provide the stimulus, but then you got to stand back and watch what happens. You never know, right? What's the crowd going to do? What are they going to go after?
Well, related to what you're saying, so I love that. And it's about, so there's a couple of parts to that. There's the content of the story. It's what will we be telling stories about?
Right.
There's that one. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it is that there's also what format will we be using? The reason why I think of it in this way is that I'm this differentiation expert, but I also coach people on writing books and giving speeches. And so like writing that stuff. So I thought a lot about creation of content that shakes people up. And so there's the content piece, tell a story about something that's surprising. Tell a story about a moment that's makes you proud. Tell a story about a moment that was dangerous. Tell a moment, right? So you frame it in some way where people's minds go to a specific direction. But then there's also how are you going to get this story or these ideas out of your head? And the reason why this is resonant with me today is, so I was working with a client today on coaching her on writing her book. And so one of the homework assignments I gave her a few different homework assignments. And one was, I want you to take your topic, forgetting what the topic is for the time being. I want you to take your topic and I want you to write whatever scenes come to your mind when you think about the topic. They don't have to be complete thoughts. It's just whatever, like, you don't have to tie everything up with a bow. You can stop in like mid-scene. It doesn't matter to me. Like, write a scene multiple scenes that come to mind. And I said also write images that come to mind. And those two things can be very separate. Like, a scene to me is connotations of a fully developed action, whereas an image is really just, like a piece of something that's happening. And so I will often ask people to explore a topic from different formats, because I find different formats generate different kind of thinking in things, if that makes sense. The idea of images, like, that's always been a very powerful way for me to produce. I'm reminded of Allen Ginsberg in one of his poems in the book Howl. It wasn't Howl. It wasn't that poem, which is the dominant poem in the book, but it was one of the other poems in the book. He talks about going to a supermarket to shop for images, and this idea of shopping for images, which I think is the line. If I have to create something, a publicity stunt, a differentiation, a book, or something, I will often start walking around and looking and thinking in images, about images. Like, I'll walk past where I live here. There are these small yellow flowers that are growing out by the traffic sign. So, I'll stop and look at the small, or I'll put it differently. My wife was driving and she had to stop the car suddenly because there was a photographer with a long lens who was standing in the street taking a picture of our property, of these small, she had the lens like 6 inches away from the flowers or whatnot. And, Stella said, this woman, I hope, she shouldn't be standing in the street. But it's this idea of capturing the image. That's how I start to create. It's like, oh yeah, here's this image. Now, where could this image go? Or here's this scene. Where could this scene go? Or here's this story, the surprise story, or this story, right? Makes sense? The format that you use can mean everything to what it is that you're trying to do. I know that when I write a speech, I will always use too many words in the speech when I'm writing it out for myself. And then I'll also get bored sometimes writing it out for myself. And I don't like to be bored when I'm creating, because I feel that if you're bored when you're creating, that boredom will show up in what it is you're producing, and the listener will be bored, right? So you can't be bored with what it is that you're doing. So I'll actually, if I'm writing a speech and I'm getting bored with it or antsy with it, I'll often just stand up as if I'm on stage, and I'll start saying the speech. I'm not going to read it. I know what I wrote already, and I'll start saying it, and I'll speak it into existence.
Wow.
In other words, I'll just stand there and continue the speech as if this is the speech I was supposed to give. Whatever it is that I say, it's again, I may have quoted her before. There's a woman from Stanford who taught improv who said this. It's the idea of, I'll make it right after I've said it. Mm-hmm. So I don't wait for the right words. I say what I'm going to say, and then I shape them while they're coming out. Uh-huh. And I just, right. And by the way, and then we'll go back to what you were saying, and to associations, forgive me, or I think this has relevance to all of us. But, this idea of shaping it once it comes out, people will ask me, but you wrote a speech. Aren't you concerned that you're leaving something out? If you just get up and start doing it, and that becomes the speech, what it is you're doing. And I say, I have enough faith in myself that whatever it is I say, I assume that was the right speech. to give. Does that make sense? In other words, if I left something out, the editor part in me just said, forget that part, whether it did consciously or not. So if I don't say it, it didn't need to be said. That's the game I play with it, at least. Does that make sense?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I find it. So I do a lot of advising to CEOs, and I've had the opportunity to work with probably like 120, 130 CEOs, right? Over 100 in the association space, and then, all different kinds in the private sector and public sector. And the CEOs who are the best, first of all, are the ones who are uncensored. They're living all out, full out, and they're very comfortable working from their intuition. So that intuitive editor that's in your unconscious is a friend, right? It's not an enemy. It's not somebody that you're trying to figure out how to compensate for. It's actually an ally who's helping you be better at being yourself. And, there's you might help me tell this, that great Jewish joke about the Shmuel who dies and he goes to heaven and he's talking to God when he gets there. And he says, I wanted to be more like Moses. And God says, you should have been more like Shmuel, right? Which is like this idea that you are an amazing human being. And and you need to bring that out instead of trying to be like someone else. When I work with leaders, a lot of the time I find that they are grappling with this self-criticism that can be crippling, and certain ideas that they don't share until they feel like they've really rationalized them, thought them through, tried to punch holes in them, they feel really defensive about putting their thoughts and ideas out there. And yet, when I look at their organizations, I see the organization as a reflection of the current state of their leadership, who they are. I mean, in many ways, organizations embody the CEO's personality, for better or worse. And those CEOs that are most comfortable in their own shoes, those CEOs who are willing to say something and then address how to fit it properly, are the ones who really do an excellent job of pushing themselves out. So a lot of what I do with the CEO is I'll try and get them to relax more, to feel more comfortable about being themselves, to not have to be perfect, right? So that their leadership can become more available, so that they can exert more of their influence over the organization.
How do you help them to adopt this feeling of they can be less than perfect? What's your?
It's usually through a combination of conversation with them. So I might be going over a speech that they're going to give or a change program that they've engineered. And we'll be talking about the different elements, and I'll be asking questions. Why do you want to do that? Where did that come from? And if I sense a hesitancy, like if somebody has a hard time saying, I don't know where that came from, I'll dive into it. And I'll say, look, it's fine that you don't know where it came from. Some of the greatest inventions in the world came when people were dreaming, or their intuition. So I want you to feel comfortable with that part of you. And then that gets combined with me actually shadowing them. So I will accompany them to a speech, or I will sit in a room where they're addressing their senior team. And so that I can watch them in action. And then afterwards we debrief, and I'll talk about where it looked to me like they were holding themselves back, or where somebody's comment actually knocked them off balance, and what they might do in the future to, maintain their sense of equilibrium and so on.
Yeah. What you're talking about reminds me a few years ago, I did kind of a session in rejection therapy.
Rejection therapy?
Yeah, it wasn't that exactly. I think that's an actual school of thought. But so I was at this conference, and one of our assignments, like a lunch assignment, we had like an hour to go out, or 45 minutes to go out, and we had to be rejected. We had to go out in the street. This was in Portland. So
it makes it even harder.
Right, exactly. Right. And Portland, Oregon, we're talking about. Right? So I went out with some friends, and I did things like, you were supposed to be rejected and get no's, but it was really hard to get people to reject me. They just didn't. Well, they rejected me, but they weren't like offended. So, for instance, someone was standing there with a pink box, which was overtly from Voodoo Donuts, the famous Portland, Oregon place. And so I went up to him and I said, "That's from Voodoo Donuts, right?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "I hear those donuts are great. Can I have one?" And he didn't give me one, by the way. but he was not offended. But it was not like some another guy I walked up to and I said, "Hey, that bag looks really interesting. What do you have in it?" And we were discussing, but it was straight. We did lots of different things. But of course, people who I was with, one person went up to an open window in a bakery and said, "Wow, that whatever baked good, whatever it was a big thing, like looks great. Can I have that?" And the person said, "Okay." And she put it in a bag.
And which goes to show, if you ask for things, you may get it, right? Even if it sounds preposterous.
Right. But I think that the idea behind it, because it was a very memorable exercise, was, you'll get turned down and it's not the end of the world. And behind you have to get a lot of no's to get yeses and so forth. It was things like that. And all that has to do to me with perfectionism, kind of knocking you off your perfectionistic horse.
We'll talk about your perfectionistic horse when we come back for our next episode of Planet of the Associations.